The snow had started falling early that year. The white flakes covered the pine trees and hills like a blanket, and the world became silent. Deep in the mountains of northern Arizona stood a small log cabin made by a man named Apache. Once that cabin was full of laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and the sound of his wife Lena humming while she cooked by the fire. But now it stood quiet, surrounded by endless white. The only sound was the wind that howled through the cracks and the creaking of the frozen roof. Apache sat by the fireplace, staring into the glowing embers. His rough hands were scarred from years of work, but tonight they trembled slightly as he held a small piece of cloth, Lena's old scarf. It still carried the faint scent of wild lavender. She had passed away the previous winter when a fever took her in just 3 cold nights. He had tried everything he knew, herbs, prayers, even carrying her outside so she could feel the last bit of sunlight. But nothing helped. When she died, something inside him froze too. After that, he stopped talking to people. The small town nearby didn't see him anymore. The shopkeeper used to see him once a month for supplies, but now even that had stopped. His horses wandered freely around the property, and his once beautiful garden had turned into frozen ground. Apache barely ate, living on dried meat and melted snow. His only companion was his loyal dog, Bear, a large black shepherd who followed him everywhere. Each morning, Apache chopped wood until his muscles ached, then sat by the fire as the sun went down, listening to the crackle of the flames. He sometimes talked to Bear as if talking to himself. "Another day, boy," he'd mutter. "We made it through another day." Bear would wag his tail and rest his head on Apache's knee. But the man's eyes were always empty, looking past the fire into memories he could never bring back. One evening, as the sky turned gray and the snow began to fall again, Apache took his axe and went to the forest behind his cabin. The cold air bit into his face. His breath came out as white clouds. He had walked that path 1,000 times before, yet it felt heavier now, as if the weight of his loss followed him with every step. He chopped until the daylight faded and the forest grew darker. Then he lifted the last log onto his shoulder and turned to head home. That was when he noticed something unusual: footprints in the snow. They were small, lighter than his own, and fresh. They led toward his cabin. He stopped for a moment, heart beating faster. No one ever came this far in winter. Who could it be? He followed the tracks cautiously, Bear walking beside him, ears alert. As he reached his cabin door, the firelight flickered through the cracks, but he hadn't left it burning when he went out. His hand tightened on the axe. Quietly, he pushed open the wooden door. Inside, near the fire, sat a young native girl. She was wrapped in old animal hides, her long black hair tangled and wet from the snow. She trembled as she held her hands close to the flames. When she saw Apache, she tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Apache put down his axe. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe here." The girl's lips moved, but her words were faint and broken. "Cold, hungry," she whispered in a mix of English and her native tongue. Apache knelt down and gave her a piece of bread and a cup of water. She ate slowly, as if every bite took effort. He asked her name. She looked at him and said, "Ayana." Her voice was soft like the wind in the trees. It meant eternal blossom, though he only learned that later. She told him she was from a small tribe that had moved south before the winter storms. On the way, she and her younger brother got separated. She had been wandering for days trying to find shelter, and finally saw the smoke from his chimney. Apache listened quietly, not knowing what to say. For a long time he had not spoken to another soul, and now a young girl sat by his fire, half frozen and alone. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't felt since Lena's death. Compassion. He gave her a thick blanket and told her to rest near the fire. She nodded weakly, her eyes closing almost instantly. Bear curled up beside her as if protecting her. Apache watched them both. For the first time in many months, his cabin didn't feel completely empty. That night, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled against the door, Apache sat awake by the fire. He looked at the sleeping girl and thought of Lena. He remembered how she would care for travelers passing through, always with a warm meal and a kind word. She had a way of lighting up any dark day. He wondered if this girl was sent by fate, or perhaps by Lena's spirit to remind him that kindness must not die with grief. In the morning, the storm had worsened. Snow covered the windows and blocked the door. Apache cooked a small stew with the little food he had left: deer meat, potatoes, and a pinch of herbs. When Ayana woke up, she tried to thank him in her broken English. Her smile was small but sincere, and for the first time in a year, Apache felt warmth that didn't come from the fire. Days passed, and the storm trapped them together. Ayana began to regain her strength. She helped by cleaning the cabin, brushing the horses, and melting snow for water. Though they spoke different languages, they found ways to understand each other through simple gestures. She would point at things, asking their English names, and he would repeat them slowly. Her laughter, quiet at first, started to fill the cabin. At night, she sang in her native tongue, songs about rivers, stars, and freedom. Apache listened silently. He didn't understand the words, but he could feel the emotion in her voice. It reached deep into his soul, melting something that had been frozen for too long. He began fixing things around the cabin, patching holes, cleaning tools, and brushing his horses. Ayana's presence gave him reason to move again. Even Bear seemed livelier, wagging his tail more often. The silence that had haunted the place for a year was slowly replaced by the sound of life returning. But one evening, when the snow finally began to ease, Apache found himself staring into the fire again. The question he had avoided now stood before him. What would happen when the storm cleared? The girl had her people waiting somewhere out there. She couldn't stay forever, yet the thought of her leaving made the cabin feel cold again. That night he dreamed of Lena for the first time in many months. She stood by the fireplace, smiling, her voice soft as always. "Don't close your heart, my love," she whispered. "Winter doesn't last forever." When Apache woke up, tears filled his eyes. The morning sun was rising through the frosted window, casting golden light on Ayana as she fed the fire. Apache realized that maybe life was giving him another chance, not to replace what he lost, but to remember that the heart still beats even after great sorrow. The cabin that once felt like a tomb was alive again, and somewhere deep inside he whispered to himself, maybe this home wasn't meant to stay empty forever. Outside, the wind had finally calmed, and for the first time since Lena's passing, Apache stepped out into the cold morning with a quiet smile. The snow sparkled like diamonds under the new sun, and behind him through the open cabin door came the soft sound of laughter, gentle, healing, and full of hope. The heavy snow outside began to melt slowly, but Apache's cabin still stood wrapped in cold white. Days had turned into weeks since Ayana had found her way to his lonely home. What began as a silent rescue had now become a quiet companionship. The blizzard had locked them together, and in that stillness, something began to heal inside both of them. Every morning, Apache woke to the sound of crackling fire and Ayana humming softly as she cooked porridge over the hearth. It was a sound he hadn't heard in so long, the sound of another voice in his home. The cabin that once felt like a grave now smelled of life again. Warm food, burning wood, and a faint scent of pine that Ayana brought in with fresh branches. Apache started noticing little things. The way she carefully folded the blankets each morning, the way she patted Bear's head when she passed, the way she smiled when the fire sparked to life. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was often about nature, about the way the trees whispered to each other, or how the stars never lost their way. Apache listened quietly. Her words reminded him that the world was still beautiful, even when it hurt. One afternoon, as the storm eased, Ayana stood by the window and watched the sunlight melt the icicles hanging from the roof. "Soon spring," she said with a shy smile. Apache nodded. "Yes, spring," he replied softly. It felt strange to say the word after such a long, hard winter. That evening, she asked him about Lena. Apache froze for a moment, staring at the fire. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in over a year, but Ayana's gentle eyes told him it was time. He told her how he and Lena built the cabin with their own hands, how they raised horses together, and how Lena used to sing to the mountains when the sun went down. His voice trembled, but for the first time the pain didn't break him. Instead, it felt like a story that needed to be told. When he finished, Ayana sat quietly for a while. Then she said softly, "Your wife, she loved this place. Her spirit's still here. She happy you live." Her broken English carried deep meaning, and somehow Apache believed her. He looked out the window at the mountains glowing in moonlight and whispered, "Maybe you're right." As the snow melted more each day, Apache and Ayana worked side by side. She helped him carry wood, fetch water, and feed the horses. Sometimes they laughed when she struggled with heavy logs or slipped in the mud. Apache hadn't laughed like that in years. He taught her simple English words, fire, sky, bread, and she taught him her language's words for the same things. Soon their days were filled with small lessons and shared smiles. One morning, Apache took her to the back of the cabin where Lena's grave rested under an old cedar tree. The snow had begun to clear, revealing the wooden cross he had carved by hand. Ayanna knelt quietly and placed wildflowers she had found near the riverbank. The flowers were small, but their colors were bright against the melting snow. Apache's chest tightened. He hadn't placed flowers there since Lena's funeral. He looked down at the grave and whispered, "Thank you for sending her, Lena." Ayanna stood beside him, her eyes kind. For the first time, Apache didn't feel alone standing by that grave. The cold wind blew softly through the trees, and he thought he could almost hear Lena's laughter in it. As the days grew warmer, the valley around them came alive again. Streams began to run and the horses grazed on fresh grass. Birds returned, filling the mornings with chirping songs. Ayanna's laughter mixed with them as she worked outside, washing clothes or collecting herbs. She began teaching Apache small healing ways, how to mix crushed leaves for sore muscles, how to use sage smoke to calm the spirit. Her knowledge fascinated him, and he realized how much wisdom she carried despite her young age. One day, a traveler passed by the cabin on horseback. He told Apache he had seen a small tribe camped far to the south. "They're looking for a missing girl," he said. "Said she disappeared in the snow." Ayanna's eyes widened. It was her people. Apache thanked the man and gave him food before he rode away. That night, Ayanna sat by the fire in silence. Apache could see the conflict in her eyes. "You should go back to them," he said quietly. "They're your family." She looked down, her hands tightening on her blanket. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "But Heart—" She touched her chest lightly. "Heart not ready." Apache didn't know what to say. He understood. Sometimes the heart needed more time to heal than the body. For the next few days, Ayanna helped him with chores as usual. But something in her movements felt slower, like she was preparing to leave. When the day finally came, Apache packed some food and warm clothes for her. The morning sun was bright, the snow almost gone. Ayanna stood at the door, looking around the cabin that had saved her life. "Thank you," she said softly. "You good man. You give me home." Apache tried to smile, but it was hard. "You saved me too," he said quietly. "You brought life back here." She nodded, eyes shining. Then she turned and began walking down the snowy trail. Bear followed her for a few steps before turning back. Apache stood by the doorway, watching until she disappeared among the trees. The cabin felt silent again, almost painfully so. Days passed. The silence returned, but it was different now. It didn't hurt the same way. The memory of Ayanna's laughter still lingered in the corners of the cabin. Apache spent his days repairing the roof, fixing fences, and working with his horses again. He was alone, but not empty. Something had changed. He had started living again. But one morning, as the first spring flowers bloomed outside, Apache heard footsteps crunching on the dirt path. He turned and froze. Ayanna was walking toward him, carrying a small basket of herbs and smiling shyly. "Tribe, move away," she said. Come back. My heart here." For a moment, Apache couldn't speak. Then slowly, a warm smile spread across his face, a smile he hadn't felt in years. "Welcome home," he said softly. From that day forward, the cabin truly came back to life. Together, they planted vegetables, painted the walls, and cared for the animals. Apache taught her how to ride his horse properly, and she taught him how to make herbal tea that could heal almost any ache. The nights were filled with conversation and laughter. Sometimes they would sit outside under the stars while Ayanna told him stories from her tribe. Stories about the sky spirits, the animals and the songs of the earth, and travelers who came through the valley began to speak of a man who once lost everything, and a young woman who brought warmth back to his frozen world. They said the cabin glowed at night with golden light, and the sound of laughter could be heard even in winter. Years later, when Apache stood outside on a spring morning, he looked across the valley covered in flowers. The air was soft and the sky clear. He thought about the journey he had lived, the sorrow, the loneliness, and the miracle that had followed. He felt peace, something he never thought he'd feel again. He often whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Lena. Thank you for sending her to me." He believed Lena's spirit had guided Ayana to his door that night. And though life had taken one love away, it had gifted him another kind of love. The love of companionship, understanding, and new beginnings. As the sun rose behind the mountains, Apache stood outside with Bear beside him and Ayana tending to the garden. The smoke from their chimney curled into the blue sky, and laughter echoed from inside the cabin. The long winter had finally ended, not just in the valley, but in Apache's heart. The man who once lived in silence had found life again, all because one lost girl had followed a trail of smoke to a lonely cabin and lit its fire once more.